Today, Today we are going to discuss development policymaking and the roles of market, state, and civil society. A question of balance. National governments have played an important role in the successful development experiences of the countries in East Asia. In other parts of the world, including some countries in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and the transition countries, government often appear to have been more of a hindrance than a help. This chapter examines the balance of and relationships between states and the markets in the process of economic development. So, achieving the proper balance between private markets and public policy is a challenge. In early years of development following World War II and the colonization, a perception of the state as a benevolent supporter of development held sway, at least implicitly, but the record of corruption, poor governance, and the state captured by vested interest in so many developing countries has made this view unattainable. In this chapter, we examine the roles and limitations of planning and development policymaking as practiced in developing nations. Consider the problems of economic transition to more competitive economies and ask fundamental questions as to the proper role of the state and how public and private economic activity can best be made mutually supporting. Development planning, concepts and rationale. The planning mistake. In the initial decades after World War II and the colonization, the pursuit of economic development was reflected in the almost universal acceptance of development planning as the surest and most direct route to economic progress. Until the 1980s, few people in the developing world would have questioned the advisability or desirability of formulating and implementing a national development plan. Planning had become a way of life in government ministries, and every 5 years or so, the latest development plan was paraded out with great fanfare. National planning was widely believed to offer the essential and perhaps the only institutional and organizational mechanism for overcoming the major obstacles to development and for ensuring a sustained high rate of economic growth. To catch up with their former rules, poor nations were persuaded that they required a comprehensive national plan. The planning record, unfortunately, did not live up to its advanced billing, but a comprehensive development policy framework can play an important role in accelerating growth, reducing poverty, and reaching human development goals. Economic planning is a deliberate and conscious attempt by the state to formulate decisions on how the factors of production will be allocated among different uses or industries, thereby determining how much of total goods and services will be produced in one or more ensuing periods. Economic planning may be described as a deliberate governmental attempt to coordinate economic decision making over the long run and to influence, direct, and in some cases, even control the level and growth of nations' principal economic variable like income, consumption, employment, investment, savings, exports and imports, and etc., to achieve a predetermined set of development objectives. Economic plan is a written document containing government policy decisions on how resources will be allocated among various uses so as to attain a targeted rate of economic growth or other goals over a certain period of time. An economic plan is simply a specific set of quantitative economic targets to be reached in a given period of time with a stated strategy for achieving those targets. Economic plans may be comprehensive or partial. Comprehensive plan is an economic plan that sets targets to cover all major sectors of the national economy. Partial plan is a plan that covers only a part of the national economy, like agriculture, industry, or tourism. planning process is the procedure for drawing up and carrying out a formal economic plan. And finally, the planning process itself can be described as an exercise in which a government first chooses social objectives, then sets various targets, and finally organizes a framework for implementing, coordinating, and monitoring a development plan. Planning in mixed developing economies. So, most development plans have been formulated and carried out within the framework of the mixed economies of the developing world. These economies are characterized by the existence of an institutional setting in which some of the productive resources are privately owned and operated, and some are controlled by the public sector. The actual proportionate division of public and private ownership and control varies from country to country, and neither the private nor the public sector can really be considered in isolation from the other. However, mixed economies are often distinguished by a substantial amount of government ownership and control. The private sector in developing countries typically comprises four traditional forms of private ownership and the more recent emerging one. So the private sector in mixed economies comprises subsistence sector consisting of small-scale private farms and handicraft shops selling a part of their production to local markets. Number two is small-scale individual or family-owned commercial business and service activities in the formal and informal urban sectors. Third is medium-sized commercial enterprises in agriculture, industry, trade, and transport owned and operated by local entrepreneurs. Fourth, large jointly owned or completely foreign-owned manufacturing enterprises, mining companies, and plantations catering primarily to foreign markets, but sometimes with substantial local sales. Like capital for such enterprises usually comes from abroad, and a good proportion of the profits tends to be transferred overseas. A growing number of relatively large domestic based firms, primarily local managed and largely locally owned, often listed on national stock markets and countries such as Brazil, Russia, India, and China, but much more common in middle income than low income countries, and rare in the least developed countries. But in the context of such institutional setting, we can identify two principal components of development planning in mixed economies. Number one is the government's deliberate use of domestic saving and foreign finance to carry out public investment projects and to mobilize and channel scarce resources into areas that can be expected to make the greatest contribution toward the realization of long-term economic objectives like the construction of railways, schools, hydroelectric projects, and the other components of economic infrastructure, as well as the creation of substituting industries or projected future export sectors. Second is governmental economic policy, like taxation, industrial licensing, the setting of tariffs, and the manipulation of quotas, wages, interest rates, and prices to stimulate, direct, and in some cases even control private economic activity so as to ensure a harmonious relationship between the desires of private business operators and the social objectives of the central government. Thus, even when development planning is quite active, there is almost always a balance between the extremes of market inducement and central control, as as is readily evident from our simplified characterization of planning in mixed market economies. The rationale for development planning. The early widespread acceptance of planning as a development tool rested on a number of fundamental economic and institutional arguments. Of these, we can single out four as the most prominent. Market failure is a phenomenon that results from the existence of market imperfections like monopoly power, lack of factor mobility, significant externalities, lack of knowledge that weaken the functioning of a market economy. Various kinds of market and government failures are examined in several of the earlier chapters, but a brief review is in order here. There are three general forms in which market failure can be observed. The market cannot function properly or no market exists. The market exists but implies an inefficient allocation of resources. The market produces undesirable results as measured by social objectives other than the allocation of resources. Market failures can occur in situations in which social costs or benefits differ from the private costs or benefits of firms or consumers. Public goods, externalities, and market power are the best known examples. With public goods, free riders who do not pay for the goods cannot be excluded, except at high cost. It is economically inefficient to exclude non paying individuals from consuming these goods. With externalities, consumers or firms do not have to pay all the cost of their activities or are unable to receive all the benefits. Coordination failures occur when several agents would be better off if they could cooperate, or actions if all or most agents participated but worse off taking the action of too few participated. The market may be efficient in allocating resources at the margin, allowing certain industries to emerge and others to fall, but may be ineffective in producing large, discontinuous changes in the economic structure that may be crucial to the country's long-term development. Resource mobilization and allocation. This argument stresses that developing economies cannot afford to waste their very limited financial and skilled human resources on unproductive ventures. Investment projects must be chosen not solely on the basis of partial productivity analysis dictated by individual industrial capital output ratios, but also in the context of an overall development program that takes account of external economies, indirect repercussions, and long-term objectives. Skilled workers must be employed where their contribution will be most widely felt. Attitudinal or psychological impact. It is often assumed that a detailed statement of national economic and social objectives in the firm of a specific development plan can have an important attitudinal or psychological impact on a diverse and often fragmented population. Foreign aid. The formulation of detailed development plans has often been a necessary condition for the receipt of bilateral and multilateral foreign aid. With the shopping list of projects, governments are better equipped to solicit foreign assistance and persuade donors that their money will be used as an essential ingredient in a well-conceived and internally consistent plan of action. The requirement that developing countries must put an approved plan in place to receive various forms of assistance remains at least as true in this century as it was in the last. The development planning process. Some basic models. 3 stages of planning. So most development plans have traditionally been based initially on some more or less formalized macroeconomic model. Such economy-wide planning models can be divided into 2 basic categories. One is aggregate growth models involving macroeconomic estimates of planned or required changes in principal economic variables. And 2, multi-sector input-output social accounting and computable general equilibrium or CGE models, which ascertain, among other things, the production, resource, employment, and foreign exchange implications of a given set of final demand targets within an internally consistent framework or inter-industry product flows. Aggregate growth models, projecting macro variables. The first and most elementary planning model used in almost every developing country is the aggregate growth model. It is a formal economic model describing growth of an economy in one or a few sectors using a limited number of variables. It deals with the entire economy in terms of a limited set of macroeconomic variables deemed most critical to the determination of levels and growth rates of national output, savings, investment, capital stocks, exports, imports, foreign assistance, and so on. For planning purposes, the Harrod-Domar model has been typically formulated along the following lines. We start with the assumption that the ratio of total output to reproducible capital is constant to that KT is capital stock at time t, YT is total output, GDP at time t, and C is the average, equal to the marginal capital output ratio. Multi-sector models and sectoral projections. Input-output model or inter-industry model is a formal model dividing the economy into sectors and tracing the flow of inter-industry purchases, inputs, and sales, which is outputs. A much more sophisticated approach to development planning is to use some variant of the inter-industry or input-output model, in which the activities of the major industrial sectors of economy are interrelated by means of a set simultaneous algebraic equations expressing the specific production process by or technologies of each industry. So input-output analysis is often extended in two ways. First, by including data on factor payments, sources of household income, and the pattern of household goods consumption across various social groups such as urban and rural households. A social accounting matrix or SAM is created. A SAM therefore provides a comprehensive and detailed quantitative description of interrelationships in an economy as they exist at a point in time, making it well suited as a tool for evaluating the impact of alternative development policies. SAMs are often further elaborated with CGE models, which assume that households maximize utility and firms maximize profits. The CGE approach is more complicated than a SAM, but its value lies in enabling policymakers to take into account the possible reactions of consumers and firms to the alternative policies being considered rather than assume that they will behave the way that they did before the new policies were implemented. Project appraisal and social cost benefit analyses. Project appraisal is the quantitative analysis of the relative desirability or profitability of investing a given sum of public or private funds in alternative projects. The vast majority of day-to-day operational decisions with regard to allocation of limited public investment funds are based on a microeconomic technique of analysis known as project appraisal. So, basic concepts and methodology. The methodology of project appraisals resets on the theory and practice of social cost benefit analysis, which is also used in the United States and other developed countries. Cost benefit analysis is a tool of economic analysis in which the actual and potential private and social cost of various economic decisions are weighed against actual and potential private and social benefits. Social profit is the difference between social benefits and social cost, both direct and indirect. The calculation of the social profitability of an investment is then a three-step process. First, we must first specify the objective function to be maximized. Ordinarily, net social benefit with some measure of how different benefits like per capita consumption, income distribution are to be calculated and what the trade-off between them might be. Second, to arrive at calculations of net social benefit, we need social measures of the unit values of all project inputs and outputs. Such social measures are often called accounting prices of shadow prices of inputs and outputs to distinguish them from actual market prices. Shadow prices or accounting prices are prices that reflect the true opportunity cost of resources. Market prices are prices established by demand and supply in markets. Third, finally, we need some decision criteria to reduce the stream or projected social benefit and cost flows to an index, the value of which can then be used to select or reject a project or to rank it relative to alternative projects. Computing shadow prices and social discount rates. The core social cost benefit analysis is the calculation or estimation of the prices to be used in determining the true value of benefits and the real magnitude of cost. There are many reasons for believing that in developing countries, market prices of outputs and inputs do not give a true reflection of social benefits and cost. Five such reasons in particular are often called inflation and currency overvaluation. Many developing countries are still beset by inflation and varying degrees of price controls. Controlled prices do not typically reflect the real opportunity cost to society of producing these goods and services. Number two is wage rates, capital cost, and unemployment. Almost all developing countries exhibit factor price distortions resulting in modern sector wage rates exceeding the social opportunity cost or shadow price of labor and interest rates understanding the social opportunity cost of capital. Third is tariffs, quotas, subsidies, and import substitution. The existence of high tariffs in combination with import quotas and overvalued exchange rates discriminates against the agricultural export sector and favors the import substituting manufacturing sector. Fourth, savings deficiency. Given the substantial pressures for providing higher immediate consumption levels to the masses or of poor people, the level and rate of domestic savings in most developing countries is often thought to be suboptimal. According to this argument, governments should use a discount rate that is lower than the market rate of interest in order to promote projects that have a longer payoff period and generate a higher stream of investable surpluses in the future. Fifth, the social rate of discount. In our discussion of the shadow price of savings, we mentioned the need for governments to choose appropriate discount rates in calculating the worth of project benefits and costs that occur over time. So, social rate of discount, the rate at which society discounts potential future social benefits to find out whether such benefits are worth their present social cost. Net present value, the value of a future stream of net benefits discounted to the present by means of an appropriate discount or interest rate. The social rate of discount, also sometimes referred to as a social time reference, is essentially a price of time. The rate used to calculate the net present value of a time stream of a project benefits and cost, where the net present value or NPV is calculated as this, where BT is the expected benefit of the project at time T, CT is the expected cost, both evaluated using shadow price, and R is the government's social rate of discount. Choosing projects, some decision criteria. NPV rule. Projects should be accepted or rejected according to whether their NPV is positive or negative. Compare the internal rate of return with an interest rate. So as noted, however, NPV calculations are very sensitive to the choice of a social discount rate. An alternative approach is to calculate the discount rate that gives the project an NPV of 0. Compare this internal rate of return with either a predetermined social discount rate or with less justification an estimate of either the marginal product of capital in the economy or the market rate of interest, and choose projects whose internal rates exceed the predetermined or market rate. This approach is widely used in evaluating educational investments. Internal rate of return is the discount rate that causes a project to have a net present value of 0, used to rank projects in comparison with market rates of interest. Government failure and preferences for markets over planning. Problems of plan implementation and plan failure. Theory versus practice, deficiencies in plans and their implementation, insufficient and unreliable data, unanticipated economic disturbances, external and internal, institutional weaknesses, lack of political will, conflict, post-conflict, and fragile states. We may say that the gap between the theoretical economic benefits of planning and its practical results in most developing countries has been quite large. The gap between public rhetoric and economic reality has been even greater. While supposedly concerned with eliminating poverty, reducing inequality, and lower unemployment, many planning policies in developing countries have in fact unwillingly contributed to their perpetuation. Some of the major explanations for this have to do with failures of the planning process itself. These failures in turn arise out of certain specific problems. Deficiencies in plans and their implementation. Plans are often overambitious. They try to accomplish too many objectives at once without consideration that some of the objectives are competing or even conflicting. They are often grandiose in design but vague and specific policies for achieving stated objectives. Insufficient and unreliable data. The economic value of a development plan depends to a great extent on the quality and reliability of the statistical data on which it is based. When these data are weak, unreliable, or non-existent, as in many poor countries, the accuracy and internal consistency of economy-wide quantitative plans are greatly diminished. Unanticipated economic disturbances, external and internal. Because most developing countries have open economies that are dependent on vicissitudes and of international trade, aid hoc speculative capital inflows, and private foreign investment, it becomes exceedingly difficult for them to engage in even short-term forecasting, let alone long-range planning. Institutional weaknesses. The institutional weaknesses of the planning processes of most developing countries include the separation of the planning agency from the day-to-day decision-making machinery of government, the failure of planners, administrators, and political leaders to engage in continuous dialogue and internal communication about goals and strategies, and the international transfer or institutional planning practices and organizational arrangements that may be inappropriate to local conditions. Lack of political will. Poor plan performance and the wide gap between plan formulation and plan implementation are also attributable to lack of commitment and political will on the part of many developing country leaders and high-level decision makers. Conflict, post-conflict, and fragile states. In extreme cases, violent conflict or the large-scale failure of a state to otherwise function meaningfully has resulted in catastrophic failure or even the most basic development objectives. In this case, development assistance is usually essential. So this topic will be examined in chapter 14. The 1980s policy shift toward free markets. As a result of the disenchantment with planning and the perceived failure of government intervention, many economists, some finance ministers in developing countries, and the head of the major international development organizations advocated increased use of market mechanism as a key instrument for promoting greater efficiency and more rapid economic growth. As part of their domestic market liberalization program, a majority of developing countries with differing degrees of seriousness of purpose generally sought to reduce the role of public sector, encourage greater private sector activity, and eliminate distortions in interest rates, wages, and the prices of consumer goods. Government failure. Just as markets are permitted by imperfections, so too is the government subject to a variety of failures. Thus, while in theory the government can correct a market failure, sometimes in practice it fails to do so despite costly expenditure, and in some cases might only make matters worse. Thus, government regulations may improve industry efficiency, such as by breaking monopoly power, and it may otherwise improve social welfare, such as limiting pollution. As government failures are sometimes serious even regarding rather specific interventions with overall development, planning scope for failure is larger. As we saw in chapter 4, government can help by pushing an economy toward a better equilibrium, which the unaided market cannot attain, but government could potentially make the things that much worse by pushing the economy into a bad equilibrium. That's all. Thank you for listening.